So today's lecture is the story of Adam, Eve, and Satan in the Quran, how it's presented and how Rumi interprets it. But as has been our practice, in order to take one step forward, we have to take half a step back. So a little bit of a recap. I think there's still some people who are here for the first time. So some of the things that I've emphasized, and I think there was one thing I wanted to remind us of, was how cognitive linguistics can be helpful in thinking about some fairly, I guess, big obstacles for certain people, like, I don't believe in heaven and hell, so how can I then take seriously what religion is saying? And there's a way in which I think we can use the insights of cognitive linguistics to help us at least bypass that hurdle to some degree. And it comes from looking at the way we use language, which is, again, the way we use language is based on the way our brains and bodies function. So we tend to think of one thing in terms of another thing. Metaphorical thinking is at the basis of most of our thinking processes. And a lot of it happens unconsciously. So that was one of the points I really emphasized in the last class. And where it's very helpful for us in being able to think about what is it that religious texts or myths, and then the folks from the wisdom tradition who are trying to talk about the significance of these traditions, where that comes in is to look at language and see how it is that we actually think of states as places and places as states. So this seems to be present in almost all languages in the world as far as we know. So it's something of a universal there. So just you take the example of English, we fall in love. Get me out of this place if you're feeling down or something. It's like, can somebody get me out of this, the blues, somebody get me out of these blues. So we're thinking of depression, we're thinking of love as a container in which we are, and that's our experience of it. So heaven and hell, for example, just to take this example, are then these states that are then talked about as places. So when we're feeling something, we're in that place. So for some of you, and I think I was very direct, perhaps too direct, but I know I have many friends who really do break out into hives at the mention of religion and forget about taking the word God. So in some ways, I'm really thinking about those dear friends of mine. I want to be able to, forge an idiom and to be able to have a conversation about things that are meaningful to us, and really, because of terminology in some ways, the terminology becomes an obstacle and gets in the way. So this is one possibility of being able to engage with folks who might use a different language, and yet are talking about what happens in this very body, right? I mean, we know these universals. We hunger, we thirst, we yearn, we desire, we love, we hate, all that stuff. That's universal. So what's a responsible way to be able to talk about universals without falling into the trap, which is definitely something to watch out for, of erasing differences, important differences. I think there's some differences that ought to be erased because they're incidental, coincidental, not really essential. And then there are other differences that need to be maintained and be looked at because they teach us how it is that different humans, different cultures, actually are able to live this life differently. And that's, I think, where true learning really takes place. Anyways, that's a reminder of one of my hopes that I think I wanted to share with you, and that's something you will take with you. And in the same way, as we see and imagine and conceive of and experience states as places and places as states, the metaphor of life as a journey, as movement through space, is also very prevalent. So these were two keys, I would say, that one can use in reading all texts, but specifically for the purposes of these lectures. The imagery of the Quran is very much of the human being as being on a path. And the question is, how are we going on this path, and where are we going to end up? So people like Rumi, they're very much interested in not simply talking about the destination at the end. They're talking about how it is the destination is with us right now. So this was what Rumi also gives as an explanation of what is the Quran about. And if you remember, he said that this Quran, these are not stories. Talking about the story of Moses and Pharaoh. He says, don't think of them as just stories that happened a long time ago, This is your very state right now. He calls it the ready cache, you know. Somebody, a dear friend of mine, just came and forgot her cash, you know. I was thinking about this idea. Yes, right now we needed it, and it was not there, that cash. This is what we have right now. It's talking about what's happening in us right now. So, he says, the story of Moses and Pharaoh is a mask. You must find these two adversaries within yourself. And so in doing that, he also shows us, I think he's being a translator, that's the way it seems to me, who, using the correspondence of the Quran, develops between the three books. The book of the soul, our interiority, the book of the cosmos, all of the natural science, and the book of scripture. You know, that's a very important concept that comes out of Quran and gets taken up differently within Islamic philosophy, theology, and mysticism and contemplative practices. But the thread that connects all of these three books is the word that is used for the verses of the Quran. The Quran calls it signs of the book. But then there's a very beautiful verse of the Quran in which God says that we shall show them, meaning human beings, our signs, which are also the verses of the Quran, same word, ayat, in the horizons outside and in their own souls. So that this verse becomes the Quranic verse, becomes the locus, the place in which these three books are talked about. So the book of scripture, which is composed of signs, is telling us how to see signs within ourselves and how to see signs outside. So it's a way of bringing together the cosmos and the different realities that we inhabit, right? We live an interior life. We read signs outside. Books are some of those signs, and then there's a natural science. So this is what Rumi is trying to do. I think he's trying to educate us and show us how it is that we can figure out what kind of an emotion or a sensation or a place or a feeling corresponds to a certain kind of verse of the Quran, or to a sign or a person in the Quran or in scripture or in stories. And he tells many stories too. So it's not like just the stories of the Quran are the ones that do it. Other stories are also able to do it, because we also know this from contemporary research into the way the mind works and what the effect of stories and fiction and narratives is on our brain, that when we read something, especially something that's imagistic, it really is our lived experience. We mimic it. Our body fires, you know, just like what's happening in a dream, except that in the dream, usually, a lot of people sleepwalk as well, but usually, you know, by a certain age, our bodies have figured out how to be able to stop our brains, what the brain is living, to be translated into action. So we are really, the same neurons are firing, it's just that we don't act them out. So that's just the human reality, I think, and I think we're, from my perspective, I feel like we're at a very good place in terms of knowledge of how it is that we work from the perspective of science, that we can appreciate some of the value and wisdom of what these pre-modern traditions have to teach us. And one of the other things I think I want to remind us of is that it might be useful to think about religious traditions once one gets over, if you are allergic to it a little bit, get over that, from the perspective of that these traditions have come up with an answer to the questions that human beings have to encounter. We have to figure out who we are and have to learn to live with competing influences within ourselves. You know, a part of me wants to eat, another part of me, you know, wants to have something else, another part wants something else. How do we contain this and make this into a unit? And then, how does this unit function with all the other units who are composed of their own competing demands? So the variables are pretty remarkable, and add into that the natural rhythms and the challenges that are posed by the environment, and we have a very complicated equation you could use the scientific word here, you know, an equation that needs to be solved. So in some ways it seems like with different variations, different human societies, through experimentation, let's call it that, came up with fairly similar solutions. I mean, that would be another interesting way to be able to think about empirically speaking, that this is actually the result of a lot of experimentation. So there's value there, there's worth there, that is data that we should think about in terms of thinking about who are we and how we should act. So I'm trying to present what Rumi is saying in that light. So hopefully it is something that no matter what your disposition, you might find some value in. And then, I think so the Quran is depicting the states through its stories, is depicting the states of ourselves. Moses and Pharaoh depict the two primary qualities within us, one that is able to follow guidance and the other that stands up and fights against guidance and Pharaoh wants to take divinity and control for himself. And then Rumi's criteria for judging whether or not an interpretation is correct or not. I don't know if somebody remembers that, but I did bring the Persian for that. I was asked if we would be reciting poetry. Let me recite this one verse, which I did bring. So his criteria for judging the correctness of an interpretation is this. Hak buvat ta'wil ki an garmat kunat, pur umido chust ba sharmat kunat. Hak buvat ta'wil ki an garmat kunat, pur umido chust ba sharmat kunat. So it is true, that interpretation is true if it warms you up. It makes you hopeful and smart or really, like energetic, and makes you modest. And there's something very interesting about this modesty aspect that comes up in the story of Adam and Eve today, and we'll come up with that. So that's, in terms of the half step, some of the things we've talked about. So it's a very pragmatic criteria that Rumi is giving us of how to see whether we're reading scripture properly. So for today's lecture, today's talk, I want to talk about the Quranic story of Adam and Eve and Satan. And I think I'll read out a little bit just to give you a flavor for how the Quran tells the story. This is from the translation that came out, was put up by Oxford about 10 years ago or so by Mr. Abdul Halim, who is a very senior scholar of the Quran. And so it's a paperback available. It's a good one if you are interested. But of course, I think it's best if you really want to study the text of the Quran, it's good to get a few different translations. A translation of the Quran is literally just an interpretation. The text itself, very much, is only considered by Muslims to be the Quran if it is in the original. And that's the way it's usually recited as well. And most Muslims are not Arabs, so they don't understand Arabic. So in many ways, the equivalent of, just an aside note here, the equivalent of the Quran, the way to understand the Quran is that it performs the same function as Jesus performed in Christianity. So the Quran is the Word of God, and Jesus is the Word of God. So it's really, I think, key in that. So a lot of Muslims really just receive the Quran, preserve it, in a very similar way that a lot of Christians would go and take communion. You don't have to understand the mystery there. You just have to take it into your body. So the Quran really works in that way, to just the vibrations of it and reciting it is considered to be a transformative thing. And of course, one understands the meaning of it through sermons and many other things. So here's the Quranic story of Adam, Eve, and Satan. So addressing the prophet and through the prophet, other listeners, God says, when your Lord told the angels, I am putting a successor, a representative on earth. They said, the angel said, how can you put someone there who will cause corruption and bloodshed while we celebrate your praise and proclaim your holiness? But God said, I know things that you do not. He taught Adam all the names. Then he showed them to the angels and said, tell me the names of these if you truly think you can. They said, may you be glorified, God. We have knowledge only of what you have taught us. You are the all-knowing and all-wise. Then he said, Adam, tell them the name of these. When he told them their names, God said, did I not tell you, speaking to angels, that I know what is hidden in the heavens and the earth, and that I know that you reveal and what you conceal? So that's the first kind of snapshot we're given. And then there's a little bit of a jump. Again, the same formula. When we told the angels, so this is God addressing. The we is God speaking of God's self. When we told the angels, bow down before Adam, they all bowed. But not Iblis, who refused and was arrogant. He was one of the disobedient. We said, Adam, live with your wife in this garden. Both of you eat freely there as you will, but do not go near this tree, or you will both become wrongdoers. But Satan made them slip and removed them from the state they were in. We said, God said, get out, all of you. You are each other's enemy. On earth, you will have a place to stay and livelihood for a time. Then Adam received some words from his Lord, and he accepted Adam's repentance. He is the ever-relenting, the most merciful. We said, get out, all of you. But when guidance comes from me, as it certainly will, there will be no fear for those who follow my guidance, nor will they grieve. So that's the first incidence of the story. And the story is recited in different versions multiple times, at least 7 different versions of the story, in which different parts of the story are focused on depending on the situation. And this is something I mentioned last time, that the Qur'an was revealed over a period of 22 years, according to Islamic tradition. And it was very much revealed as the situation demanded. So sometimes, some aspect of the same story is brought out, and other times, a different aspect is brought out. You know, it's just like if a friend asks you, how was your vacation? In one day you might meet 3 or 4 people, but you might tell something slightly different to each person, depending on, I don't know, maybe even your level of energy, and the interest of the person. So there's something very, I think, important about this aspect of the Quran. So another version, I'll just go through and read a few of these different versions for you. I think 3, I brought 3. So now this is another chapter. God is speaking again. We, God, established you on the earth, speaking to people, and provided you with a means of livelihood there. Small thanks you give. We created you, we gave you shape, then we said to the angels, bow down before Adam, and they did. But not Iblis. He was one of those who bowed down. He was not one of those who bowed down. God said, speaking to Iblis, what prevented you from bowing down as I commanded you? And he said, I am better than him. You created me from fire and him from clay. God said, get down from here. This is no place for your arrogance. Get out. You are contemptible. But Iblis said, God, give me respite until the day people are raised from the dead. And God replied, you have respite. And then Iblis said, because you have put me in the wrong, I will lie in wait for them all on your straight path. I will come at them from their front and their back, from their left and their right, and you will find that most of them are ungrateful. God said, get out. You are disgraced and banished. I swear I shall fill hell with you and all who follow you. But you and your wife Adam live in the garden. Both of you eat whatever you like, but do not go near this tree, or you will become wrongdoers. Satan whispered to them so as to expose their nakedness, which had been hidden from them. He said, your Lord only forbade you this tree to prevent you becoming angels or immortals. And he swore to them, I am giving you sincere advice. He lured them with lies. Their nakedness became exposed to them when they had eaten from the tree. They began to put together leaves from the garden to cover themselves. Their Lord called to them, did I not forbid you to approach that tree? Did I not warn you that Satan was your sworn enemy? They replied, our Lord, we have wronged our souls. If you do not forgive us and have mercy, we shall surely be among the losers. He said, all of you get out. You are each other's enemies. On earth you will have a place to stay and livelihood for a time. He said, there you will live, there you will die, from there you will be brought out. Children of Adam, so now coming to addressing the people to whom the Quran is addressed. Children of Adam, we have given you garments to cover your nakedness and as adornment for you. The garment of God consciousness is the best of garments. This is one of God's signs, so that people may take heed. Children of Adam, do not let Satan seduce you as he did your parents, causing them to leave the garden, stripping them of their garments to expose their nakedness to them. He and his forces can see you from where you cannot see them. We have made evil ones allies to those who do not believe. And here's a third and last version that I've chosen, even though I said like there's at least 7. And this is again in a different context. According to Islamic tradition, this is addressing a specific occasion in which Prophet Muhammad, as he was hearing the Qur'an from Gabriel, was trying to recite it quickly. And I think he stumbled over some words. So this revelation comes afterwards. So it's a in some ways, very interesting, alive kind of a text. So there's places where, people talk about why was this revealed, and there's, in Islamic tradition, sources that talk about the reason for the revelation. There's a whole science associated with the Quran, which is called the occasions/reasons of revelation. So some of the verses are given their historical context as well. Otherwise, it's very hard to understand them. So, prophet, do not rush to recite before the revelation is fully complete, but say, Lord, increase me in knowledge. Don't reach out and try and pull it. Just wait there as it's coming. We also commanded Adam before you, but he forgot, and we found him lacking in constancy. When we said to the angels, bow down before Adam, they did, but Iblis refused. So we said, Adam, this is your enemy, yours and your wife's. Do not let him drive you out of the garden and make you miserable. In the garden you will never go hungry, feel naked, be thirsty, or suffer from the heat of the sun. But Satan whispered to Adam, saying, Adam, shall I show you the tree of immortality and power that never decays? And they both ate from it. And this is really a key part of the Qur'anic narrative. They both ate from it. They're always doing it together, They became conscious of their nakedness and began to cover themselves with leaves from the garden. Adam disobeyed his Lord and was led astray. Later, his Lord brought him close, accepted his repentance, and guided him. God said, get out of the garden as each other's enemy. So these are 3 different versions of the Quranic story of Adam and Eve and Iblis. So you must have noticed that in some instances the word Iblis is used, and then the same story, same narrative shifts over and calls and uses the word Satan. So Iblis is the name of Satan before he became Satan, according to the Quran. And according to the Quran, Iblis was one of the jinns, which are creatures made out of fire. So element fire is predominant there. And he loved God so much, and he worshipped God so much, that through thousands and thousands of years of worship, he slowly raised himself and was raised in his level until he got to the level of the angels that stand at close to the throne of God, near God's footstool, basically, which is the closest that created things come. So he became one of the most exalted beings in the world. So we're talking about one of these beings. This is the being that then falls. And the reason for the fall, as you can see, as the Quran very clearly says, is his arrogance. I'm made out of fire. I'm better than he is. There's many things one can mention about the story, and as can be imagined, different thinkers have found a lot of fertile material here in thinking about what it is that is being meant, and what lessons are we to draw from it, and what does it tell us about what's going on. And then I think, so we can maybe I'll just start from the beginning before we get to Rumi and just look at the things that are being pointed out. God tells the angels before Adam's creation that he's about to create a successor. This is the word Khalifa, which gets translated into English as caliphate, caliph. I'm about to create a caliph on earth. And Khalifa, the word Khalifa, is somebody who literally stands in place of somebody else, a lieutenant. The one who stands in place of, the governor or somebody, lieutenant, a governor, vice regent, a successor. So all of those are synonymous terms. So in the Quranic story, the fact that Adam has to come down, Adam and Eve have to come down to the earth is already stated. So it's very interesting that in one way, it's not, even though the later version of the Quran says that, if you're in the garden, you will never have, all of these different hardships, hunger or, heat or too much heat and stuff. And yet, human beings were always created, according to the Quran, to be on earth as God's representatives. So, in some ways, that story or that hint in the beginning sets up the question for the readers, for the listeners. The question is, how is this going to come about? As opposed to, oh, it didn't have to happen, and look at because of that slip, the situation we are in. It was not a mistake, according to the Quran. And I think that's very important to understand the Quranic vision of what the human being is and what the purpose of the human being in creation is. And the angel's response is really awesome, isn't it? It's like, what? You're going to create somebody who's going to cause corruption and shed blood. So they had enough knowledge, these beings made out of light. Angels are beings made out of light. They are created beings. And they partake in some of God's knowledge. But they were like, we can see what this being that you're going to make is going to do. Why? Because Adam's created out of clay. There are versions in the Quran, parts of the Quran, where it talks about how God made Adam from clay. In another version, it's potter's clay. And you know how potters need to really treat their clay in order for it to become, it has to ferment. So it's fermented clay that's being spoken about. And it's going to be an important thing for Rumi later on in a short little section over there. So angels are looking at the composition of this being, and they can see that a being that has these qualities is going to be the cause of destruction and corruption, while we call you holy and sing your praises. So there's also a comparison going on. Why do you need Adam? Why do you need this being? Aren't we enough? We're calling you holy. And God says, I know something that you do not. And there's a very interesting arc here when one looks at it. It's the arc of education, I would say. Step by step, through whatever vast amounts of time, mythic time there are, angels are being taught what they do not know. They were not aware until Adam came about the limitations of their own knowledge. So God teaches Adam something that angels do not know. And then there's this contest, like standing, all right, angels, tell me what this is. And they're like, wow, obviously we don't know you. You did not teach us what this is. So recognize their limitation. And then Adam rattles it off, show off, Adam immediately is like, and then God says, Adam, tell them the names, and Adam tells them the names. And you can just imagine, just mythically speaking, in the same way, how tall Adam must have been standing at that point, And some texts present Adam as kind of, and Rumi also talks about it later, Adam just kind of strutting about a little bit, like this. So because of this, one of the titles of the human being in the Islamic tradition, particularly among the philosophers and the contemplatives, is the teacher of angels. Muallimul Malaika, the teacher of angels, the one who gives knowledge to the angels. And now that God has shown the angels their limitations, he says, all right, bow down to Adam. He has shown you, he has shown the angels Adam's superiority, and they all do that except Iblis, who was the jinn who had risen up. And he refuses to bow down because he says, I'm better than he is. Look at this fleshy, fermenty being. Right? You can imagine this clean, flame-like being that has purified itself in many ways, And fire is so clean, so pure. And one can understand that, if you were to just... So he obviously missed out on something about Adam. Didn't get something. And also then disobeyed God. And then God says, why did you, so you are despicable, you're despised, so get out of it. It says, you have caused me to go astray. So give me respite so I can make Adam and Adam's children go astray. Why has God caused him to go astray? So just like Adam is called the teacher of angels, Iblis, who is now on his way to becoming Satan, is called the first philosopher. Because God created everything. So he's really looking at the first cause. He's saying, you made me the way I am. If I'm not bowing down, it's because you've made me. So it's your fault. Now that you have caused me to go astray. You know? And the Quran is very clear about this. There's other places too that are just extremely clear that God is the ultimate cause of everything. So there's one verse, for example, or a sign of the Quran in which God says, we have created you and what you do. And the Islamic witnessing of faith, there is no God but God. One way of thinking about that is there is no actor but the actor. So this is one way in which the Sufi tradition, the contemplative tradition, tries to think about the human situation from one perspective, right? Who chose to be here? Who chose to be born exactly with specific parents, in a specific place, in a specific time? There's so much that's out of our control. We're given so much, right? So who caused it? So it just, goes back to the ultimate cause. So God isn't then God responsible? So the Quran says, yeah, God is responsible. So that if read too, in a very extreme kind of way, then says, oh, we are not responsible at all. But that's exactly the whole rub of it, I think. And this is where Rumi is so key. He hones in on this specific part of the story to the exclusion of many, many other parts. Because I think this goes to the whole issue of how is it that we should act, what kind of relationship should we have to the world and to ourselves in terms of our freedom of action. How much freedom of action do we have? What about our actions? How much can we do? So the Quran shows two possibles. What does Adam do though? Adam and Eve, both of them. I mean, they go and they do, what they're not supposed to. But they could have also said that, right? But they say, God, we have wronged ourselves. If you don't turn towards us and forgive us, we'll be the losers. In this, the Quran feels very hip text in some ways. So we'll be losers. That's exactly literal translations. If you don't turn towards us and forgive us, we will be losers. Literally translated, we will be losers. And then Iblis has now become Satan, and the world is going on. And as the prophet was being told, that listen, don't forget what we're telling you. Your grandfather also forgot. Satan made him slip. So the Quran is showing how the story is being used to talk about contemporary situation. So that's in a nutshell, the Quranic story of Iblis, Adam, and Eve. And I think just before we move on to what Rumi does with it, I think the things that I want to point out is that, first of all, the human being is addressed as a totality. Adam and Eve are both fully accountable. It's not the fault of one of them as opposed to the other. It's not Eve that causes this. We already know something has to happen. So even if Eve is going to cause it, it had to happen. So there's no kind of a blame put on one gender or one sex in that way. The human is what is at stake. The human is at stake. And the Quran, a little bit of an aside here, but I think is a helpful way to be able to think about it. So Adam and Eve and Iblis and Satan, that's the mythic way, that's the story way, that's the narrative way in which we're being asked to think about what the human being is like. Another way in which the Quran talks about it, it uses the word insan. And I've talked about that word, I think, briefly before. Insan is the Arabic word which means the human being, and is a generic word, and that refers to the entire race, as opposed to says insan, humans, then there's jinn, and then there's angels. So when we're talking about this category of beings, then there's humans, that word is used, or the children of Adam, that might be used as well. But there's another very beautiful depiction of the place of the human being in creation, in which the Quran, God says in the Quran, we offered the trust. I know that a bunch of you are on different boards, So you're trustees, board of trustees. Exactly that sense, you're entrusted with something. We offered the trust. God has something to give. And he wanted to give it to some being in creation. That's the image there. We offered the trust to the heavens and the earth and the mountains. but they were afraid of it and shrank away from it. But the human accepted it. Surely they put things out of place and are wrongdoers. This is another place where it's talking about the place of the human being in relationship to other creatures. And that trust is interpreted primarily as free will. Everything else does what it does. A tree grows, it doesn't choose not to grow. Animals do what they do. But there are these beings, human beings, in all this creation who seem to have possibilities, who can shape what they are. And that seems to be the trust. And another interpretation, the trust is seen as being successors of God. To act justly, to act with kindness and with mercy, those kinds of things. So that's another way of thinking about this in the Quran. There's the human, and then there's the story over here. So human beings are, to summarize, I think, that in the story in the Quran, it's showing how each being, angels, Iblis, who's jinn, becomes Satan, and then Adam and Eve themselves, they end up realizing who they are and their own limitations or what they're capable of doing. And this teaching, this education takes place through interacting with each other. More and more as I read the story year after year, that's what really comes out of it. It's a dawning of consciousness. We think we are one thing, and then something happens, and we find in ourselves something we did not think was there before. Limitation to our capacities, or an emotion that all of them came about. And then there is a choice. That's what Rumi ends up focusing on. Then there is a choice. What will we do when we find ourselves in this situation? So, as he says that the entire Quran, is depiction of the self, the states of the self. And he also says the entire Quran, Rumi says, is a depiction of the viciousness of the egos and the high state of the saints and the prophets. So he's talking about, in one of his discourses, now we move to Rumi's interpretations of some of these elements. And in this specific discourse, we have from Rumi copies of his talks, transcriptions of his talks, which was a tradition where a very wise teacher, would meet with and sit with people. Some of the students would actually transcribe, and there would be multiple scribes, and then they would compare, and there's a way to edit it. And then it also seems from this that they have been looked over, perhaps even by Rumi. But anyway, so these things that I'm about to share come from his discourses, spontaneous talks. Somebody would ask a question, Rumi would answer. So he's talking about the human ability to not see fault within oneself. And he gives the example, the story of Adam. And this is what he says. So there's a hadith, the saying of Prophet Muhammad, in which he says, God kneaded the Adam's clay with his own two hands. The Quran says God created Adam with his own two hands. So the kneading, right? It's just like bread or with the potter, a certain fermentation is taking place. So it was a process. It took a while. So now Rumi's talking about that. When God made Adam of clay and water, the human, he kneaded the clay of Adam for 40 days. He completed Adam's shell and left it for a period of time on earth. Iblis, Satan, right, came down into Adam's shell. So all of that stuff with the angels had not yet happened. So this is recalling that time. Iblis came down and went into Adam's shell. Going through and inspecting every vein, he saw that it was full of blood and humors. It was full of blood and humors. Iblis said, ew! I wonder if this is not that very Satan who at the foot of God's throne I saw would appear. That being that's supposed to come and go against God, if it exists, this must be it. So he has knowledge a little bit of what's going to happen, but he just cannot see that it's himself. It has to be this being. Look at it. It's just like stinky and it's bloody and it's full of pus or whatever, all these humors, lymph and whatever is going through it. And let me read this once again for you. And then I'll end with how Rumi ends. It's like at the end of this big discourse, he gives this story and then he greets you and leaves. When God made Adam of clay and water, he kneaded the clay of Adam for 40 days. He completed Adam's shell and left it for a period of time on the earth. Iblis came down and went into Adam's shell. Going through and inspecting every vein, he saw that it was full of blood and humors. Iblis said, "Ew, I wonder if this is not that very Satan who at the foot of God's throne I saw would appear. If that being exists, this must be it." And now Rumi says, "Peace be on you," and walks out, basically. Finishes it. Like, this is the end of everything. What he's trying to point out. It's like, peace be upon you. It's assalamu alaikum, the greeting of peace, and then you're done with it. Like, he's basically, in a sense, sealed whatever he had to say with this particular story. I mean, this reminds me a lot about, what Jesus said, You see the little thing in your brother's eye and the beam in your own eye you're not able to see. Same idea. That's what, Rumi is focusing on. And that's one of the biggest faults of the ego or the self in its selfish aspect. Even with knowledge, we think something's going to happen. We think, in different kinds of situations, we're aware that societies fall down because of X, Y, and Z, and we accuse others of it. You are that kind of an actor, right? You're going to cause the destruction of this order, and the villain who's supposed to appear and, is not going to be good. This must be it. And we make analogies, we guess, we surmise on the basis of appearances, and the basis of our own judgment and taste. I love that, ew, It really, in the Persian as well, it's just like, oh, it's like he's disgusted by it. And disgust, by the way, is a really important emotion. Psychologists talk about, a lot of times there's some really great work being done on it. And most of the time, we think that people act out of fear. But actually, a lot of the time, when we don't treat others well, we're acting out of disgust. Some really interesting work on it, and I would really recommend you look that up. So if you start looking at the language that was used in a lot of the horrible genocides that have happened, it was a language of disgust, not of fear. People were made into rodents or into cockroaches, right? That was the way it happened. So it was things that we are just repelled by as opposed to be afraid of. So there's a very important hint there. I think, and like I said at the beginning, I think we are at a very good place these days. There's enough research, good research that's done, that can illuminate some of these texts for us, these stories, and we can see the importance of what they're trying to tell us. It's disgust that is motivating Iblis. The arrogance, his sense of rightness comes out of like, wow, it's just, we know it's so deeply ingrained, it bypasses, it's not conscious. Fear is also that way, but disgust especially, it performs a very important function. We're supposed to spit out things that might be harmful for us. That's why for all bitters and things like that, coffee or other kinds of things that are bitter, we have to develop a taste for it because we are not naturally inclined towards it. It takes a while for kids to start making coffee. It's usually peer pressure, right, that does it. I mean, my kids even now, it's like I'm drinking coffee, and I'll say, why don't you smell this? Especially since I've been reading a little bit about this, psychological science. I just want to see, like, here's a chance for an experiment. So the little one, I'll show him coffee, he's like, yeah, it's coffee. So coffee is big people's drink, right? Who drink disgusting things. He just cannot imagine that, my little son, then why would you do that? So, and in our house, it's the grandmother and myself. Like, yeah, you guys drink this. So yeah, that's one of the most important points that Rumi is trying to bring across, and he sees in this story, is the inability to see our own faults and focusing on the other. And now here's a fairly long passage, but I think it's worth reading. in which Rumi interprets this story. Everything in this world, like wealth, partners, spouses, and clothes, is sought because of something else, not in and of for itself. Don't you see that if you had 100,000, I guess in our case, dollars, and were hungry or unable to find food, you couldn't eat those dollars? Sexuality is for producing children and satisfying passion. Clothing is to ward off the cold. Thus do all things form links in a chain to God. It is He who is sought for His own sake and who is desired for Himself, not for any other reason. Since He is beyond everything and is nobler and more subtle than anything, why would He be sought for the sake of what is less than Him? Therefore, it can be said that He is the ultimate. When one reaches Him, one has reached the final goal. There is no surpassing there. The human soul is a locus, a place of doubt and ambiguity. And by no means can one ever extricate the doubt and ambiguity from it without becoming a lover. Only then does no doubt or ambiguity remain. After all, is it not said in the proverb, your love for a thing makes you blind and deaf? When Iblis refused to bow down to Adam in disobedience to God's command, he said, you have created me of fire and him you have created out of clay. That is, my essence is of fire and his of clay. How is it right for a superior to bow down to an inferior? When Iblis was cursed and banished for his sin and opposition and contention with God, he said, alas, Lord, you made everything. This was your temptation of me. Now you curse me and banish me? So he's giving it a little bit more of, rather than that angry interaction with God and Iblis. It's a little bit of pathos there. So Iblis says, God, you made everything. This was your temptation of me. Now you curse me and banish me. When Adam sinned, God expelled him from paradise and said, O Adam, when I took you to task and tormented you for your sin, why did you not contend with me? You had a line of defense after all. You could have said, everything is from you. You made everything. Whatever you will. Whatever you will comes to be in the world. Whatever you will not can never come to be. You had such a clear right defense. Why did you not state it? O Lord, said Adam, I knew that, but I could not be impolite in your presence. My love for you would not allow me to take you to task. Same situation, two different responses. Two different responses. And I think the point that, and in another version of this, he tells in his poetry, the same exact story. And God says, replies to Adam in that version, says, all right then, I will also be very polite towards you, Adam. And hence the connection is repaired. Satan, Iblis, and God are estranged. That being is living in anger. And, or in a tragic vision perhaps. Look at what God made me doing. And Adam, on the other hand, and Eve, they said, we've wronged ourselves. Words reached Adam and Eve from God. So the Qur'an also says that this inspiration to actually take the blame themselves and not point to God's part in it was also an inspiration from God. Because it's very interesting, after a while, words reached Adam from his God, and he turned towards him and relented. So the word for asking for forgiveness in Arabic literally means to turn towards. Tawbah means to turn towards. So that's, I think, what's really at play over here, ultimately, is rather than turning away and imagining the person in your mind and having a, kind of a mental argument and staying in that place of anger, Adam and Eve actually turned around, faced God, and repaired that relationship through a half-truth. It's not untruth. It's a half-truth. Because Rumi asks us to consider that the logic of and it's slightly in this way, but I think this is what he might say. I'm thinking of another story, but I think the point is pretty similar that Rumi tells. That somebody came and slapped somebody really hard in the cheek. And this person was so angry. And they were about to slap the person back. And they said, stop, stop, stop. First, let us think, was the pain caused by my hand or your skin? And the person looked at them and slapped them really hard. He says, you tell me, was the pain caused by your hand or my skin? So that's the logical conclusion of that line of reasoning. You have created everything, Iblis is saying, right? But in the moment, the question is, when we act, is that our experience? We know God has created everything within a religious framework. What is our experience usually of living this world? We think we are acting. I am acting. If the I is gone, fine, then you can make that claim. Then you are not there. Then God is the actor. Then it is the reality. Your reality is there is no actor but God. But to the degree that yourself is there, your ego is there, that has specific interests and wants specific things, to the degree that you're like, I'm going to do that, aren't you responsible? Because you do take responsibility for those things. Look at what I did. If you were to say at that moment, look at what God did, things would be fine. So it's a half-truth. At one level, God has created everything, but it changes nothing, as Rumi is pointing out, for our actual lived experience. Right? That makes sense, right? Yeah. So the question becomes, in that situation, will we use the same logic that we usually use when we attribute good things to ourselves? That meeting worked well because I made that contribution. And I couldn't believe that person totally derailed that meeting. Not thinking of our own. So it's just as simple and as profound as that. It's both at the same time. That's what the analysis is about. That's what the story is. At that moment, do we stay in that place? We have two choices. We can complain and attribute the fault to the other. In this case, the other in the story is the other. Iblis attributes it to God. We attribute it to others around us. Or we can take our own role in it as well. And sometimes for the sake, this is I think one of the takeaways for me, is that sometimes for the sake of repairing a relationship, something that's technically not even fully true might be appropriate. Say, it was my fault. And then the other person will relent to it. Interesting. So we build on that truth, basically. And what this, I've been thinking about this in the context of, in the last week and a half or so, in our current cultural context as well, and I think of a lot of the critiques that, through my life that I have had, and then become, hopefully, I feel like, had a little bit more distance from it and recognized some of the problems with a certain style of thinking. But the story is about relationships, I think. And one way of thinking about it is that it is our relationship with reality. So this is one of the verses of the Qur'an, I think it is helpful in this way, that the Qur'an says, to God belong all the beautiful names. And one of the names of God is the real, haq, the real. The same word is also the word that is used for somebody's right. So one way of thinking about the Islamic religion was explained, and I learned this growing up in Pakistan. We were taught the saying of Muhammad, who said that, and it's really an interesting saying. He says, your eye has a haqq against you. Your eye has a right. You need to treat it a certain way. Your body has a right. Your children have a right. Your spouses have a right. And God has a right. Give to everything that has a right, its right. The word is haqq. Give to everything that is real, the due of its reality. So God's name is real, haqq. From the same root we get the word haqiqa, which is reality. So I think one way in which we can think about this is, how do we come to terms with a system into which we're born? Whatever system it is. It could be this body. Who inherits what? Who chooses what kind of chromosomes, what kind of genes one is going to get? The other is society, economic system. So we can say that system is what? It's the system's fault. I think that would be one application to another way of thinking about it. So I think it's asking us to consider. For me, I think these days, this is what the story is beginning to mean as well. So God is standing as a system in this story who has brought everything into being, and one response is, you caused all of this. It's your fault that I'm having this difficulty. This tragedy of my life, at this moment, what I ended up doing is because of the system that I'm in. And it's true, right? Even God in Rumi's interpretation says, yeah, it's true, of course, it's determined. But are we totally determined by the system? That's the option over there. We're not totally determined by the system. There is an option, and it's, from one perspective, it's almost an untruth. It's like, we have wronged ourselves. So there's a way in which one stays connected. So I think this story is asking us to consider also at this time, what is needed in order to keep relationships open and alive? Whether it's a relationship with God, with reality, with the system, with other human beings. And in order to do that, I think what the Qur'anic story and what Rumi is really trying to bring out is that we have to pay attention to our own choices as well. Let us not think that it's totally the fault of the system. It seems to be. Here we are, and from one perspective, sure, it's determined, but from another perspective, our experience is one of some choice. So in that limited choice, what is the better option? What is the better option? And I think this is where it ties back to his pragmatic criteria for figuring out whether an interpretation of the Quran that one is making, and in this case I would say of the world that one is making, is true or not, or is a good one. An interpretation is true if it makes you warm and full of hope and makes you, stand up straight and makes you modest. And modesty is a very interesting aspect over here, right? That he uses the word modest. And the Quran is focusing in the story so much on the idea of us becoming aware of our nakedness and wanting to cover ourselves up. And it says the garment of God consciousness is the best garment. What is it that we're trying to cover up? What is that we try to hide? There's certain things that are just going to be made manifest through our actions. And some of them will be wrong actions. We will go against something that we should not have done, and all of a sudden we become aware of ourselves. What do we do at that moment? I think that's what Rumi is trying to bring us to. There were a couple of hands that were raised. We'll just start. Tori will just begin with you when we come back. I was going to say, let's just take a break now. And then when we come back, we'll begin with Tori. Yeah. Thank you. Let's take a break. 15 minutes and we'll come back. Iblis, yeah.
He wasn't created with free will. It seems logical that he was going to...
Right, yeah, I think this is a great point that Tori is raising. Tori is saying that human beings were created with free will, and it's obvious that angels are not those beings, are not human, and hence don't have free will, and Iblis likewise does not have free will. But Tori, in the Quran, the jinns are a being who have free will. So the thing is that it's just that in our experience, humans are, so Iblis, jinn, they're called jinns, and human beings are called the two weighty ones in the Quran. The two weighty ones. I'm sorry? Yes. So angels, it's a great question. What's the difference between angels and jinns? So in Quranic angelology, some heavy words are kind of fun to say, roll off your tongue, right? Angels are beings made out of light.
Yeah.
And it's created light. God is uncreated light, and then God creates these beings of light. And then jinns are beings made out of fire. Smokeless fire.
Smokeless fire.
Smokeless fire, right, yeah. And it's obvious from the story of Iblis that he actually made his way up. It was a choice. So that shows initiative and a capacity of that class of beings to be able to get close to the source. Now, there's a whole discussion about jinns and how does one understand them, and specifically then Satan as well. And there's ways in which those discourses and debates sometimes overlap and sometimes they do not. But to go back to the Qur'anic description of angels, one way in which the Quran talks about angels is that it has the angels speaking, and the angels say, there is none amongst us that does not have a known place. So angels are beings fixed in terms of their knowledge, right? So whatever this place is. So it's obvious that even those creatures, based on the story, can still argue with God. Are you going to create somebody who's going to, shed blood and spread corruption while we praise your holiness? So it's not like they're just total robots either. It doesn't seem that way. But then later tradition adds, and the Prophet Muhammad adds a lot to the Quranic description too. So the idea of angels is so extensive in the Quran. Like, it's a really amazing, the rich and alive world. An angel, the Prophet Muhammad said, descends with each drop of rain. Because it's light. There's a way in which, there's multiple levels within even this physical thing. It contains light within it, so to speak. Because the Quran also describes the world in this way. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. And then it gives an example of a lamp that's in the niche, and there's oil in the lamp. But it's lit up without even there being any fire in it. The oil itself gives light. And it says it's lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western. It's one of my favorite verses of the Quran, especially as somebody who's east and west both, That perspective is a beautiful one, neither eastern nor western, and hence both, you see. So everywhere is the same. So God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The light here is the light, same over there. So the ways in which, there's this amazing equality going through, and I recommend, for those of you who might be interested, for me, this was very helpful, and I'm quite moved by it when I see it. Japanese Zen landscape painting. There's some of them, when you see them, there are shadows there, of course, but they really are lit. Everything is lit up. The vision of the artist is that of a really illuminated cosmos. Like somehow they're able to sense this light of the heavens and the earth. Neither eastern nor western, it's everywhere. So angels descend in every drop of rain. And there's another, since we've gotten going on this, another really beautiful memory that Muslims have with Prophet Muhammad is of him going out when it rains. He would go out when it rained, they say, and he would take off his turban or cap or whatever he was wearing and let the rain touch his head. And his companions asked him, why are you doing that? And he said, it's freshly arrived from God. Amazing sensitivity to new creation. Here is the most amazing human being, according to Muslims of all times. And he wants to be able to feel the freshness of the rain on him. The newness, the newly created, new in time. Hadith is the word that is used in Arabic, and from the same root we get the word accident. It's an occurrence, it's in time. So something so for every created thing is exactly like that. So that's why, and this is not Rumi but Ibn Arabi, he has a very beautiful explanation of, this is what he uses as the argument for explaining why is it that little babies command such power over everybody. Because they're freshly arrived, you see? And he gives as his proof the fact that that they will make even a general babble like a fool. People come there, then all of a sudden, goo, right? It starts to happen. All of us, just we cannot help ourselves. That's the power of fresh arrival. So that's what Ibn Arabi asks us to consider when we think about what the Prophet was trying to teach us. Because for him, and for a lot of folks like Rumi, whatever Muhammad was doing, was a teaching as well. Because he had insight, his actions have to be copied there. So a lot of times it's figuring out why was he doing it, what's the logic there, so that one can learn more from it. So again, I'm sorry, this is partly you can blame my teachers for this. I had one wonderful teacher, Professor William Chittick, and I remember one of the first classes, I was his graduate assistant, and I went into the class and teaching assistant for his class, and the student asked a question. Right at the beginning said, are there any questions before the reading? The student asked a question, and an hour and 20 minutes was just that, answering that question. So I apologize, and you can, complain to him. Perhaps if you feel that this is going on too long. So in the Quran, the Satan's, just a second. I'm still on that question. That's what, so I'm giving a defense for my for the fact that I was not stopping yet. I still have a few more things there. So the human beings and jinns are called the two weighty ones in the Quran, the ones who carry weight. So what will you do, the Quran asks, you two weighty ones. And the weight is again interpreted to be free will, which is like the trust that was offered to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, and from which they shrank away and were afraid of carrying. So it's, in fact, there are other beings. There is this whole class of beings with free will. It's just that our domain doesn't intersect with them, so it doesn't really concern us. So the Quran also gives an example of how when the Prophet was reciting the Quran to some Arabs, that a group of jinns was passing by and heard the revelation and became Muslim. So, I mean, it's not a small, what you asked is a very important question. I think that it raises a whole aspect of the unseen. And the Quran asks people to have faith both in the seen and the unseen. So the jinns belong to this realm of the unseen. So you can see why it is that in stories that are known by almost everybody, like 1001 Nights, the genies play such an important role. It's not something that's been imported. It was already there in the culture. And the word for genies, jinn, I apologize. It's just, why not? It's a very, I think there's a lot there that one can understand through if one focuses on it. So the word jinn comes from the same root we have the word for garden. The garden out of which Adam and Eve came. Jannah. Sometimes another language is called Jannat or Jannah. So jinn and Jannah are from the same root, from which we also get the word genius, right? So genies are the muses, the inspirers. And one of the most influential characters in Islamic history, and Rumi talks about him a lot too, I'm sure he will come and figure it out, is a guy known as Qais, who is better known as Majnun. When he's in the background of one of the most popular rock songs as well. Eric Clapton's Layla brought me to my knees, right? Layla. So Layla and Majnun are the quintessential pair of lovers that was pre-Islamic and then gets carried on. It's developed as a story. So Majnun, Qais, how he becomes Majnun? So he becomes mad in his love. So right, Rumi was saying only love can free you. Rumi tells this story of Majnun. Layla was in a different village. There was a small desert in between them. And he got on his camel and wanted to go to Layla's place. And as they were going on, he's thinking of Layla and becomes totally absorbed in his image of Layla, of his beloved. But the camel had a little baby camel, had just given birth to his camel back at Majnun's place. So while Majnun was in his reverie, in his fantasy, in the presence of the beloved's image, the camel turned around. Came back, and Majnun comes too, and he's back over there. He turns back around. And sure enough, of course, he's in love. He totally becomes deaf, dumb, and blind, right? He says, your love for a thing makes you deaf and blind. He's blind to where he is, and the camel turns back around. And it happens, and Rumi's telling, it happens for a few days, and then Majnun says, I am done with this camel. He lets it go, and then he starts walking, basically. So Majnun, yes, jinn, from jinn. I haven't forgotten your original question. So jinn, so to become mad, one attribution was given to be possessed by genies, possessed by jinn. So that's one cause of madness, Majnun. So he was called mad. His name was Qais, and then he became Majnun through his love. And hence, in many ways, free of normalcy, perhaps. So Jannah, the garden, usually these gardens that we're thinking about were behind walls, so that's why they're called walled gardens. You have to keep the elements out. Walled gardens. And the same root has to do with hiddenness. So walled garden, behind. Jinns are hidden. From the same root, we have the word janeen, which is used for a fetus inside the womb, because it's hidden. Janeen. So there's a very interesting unseen, seen, and then the power of the unseen that is at play over here. So yeah, so jinns, to conclude, jinns are beings with free will, as is proved by Iblis's rise to God. He was not at that level. He earned it, so to speak. So he had the capacity. He was moved by his love of God. He's a lover of God. He doesn't deny God's power either. He says, now that you've caused me to go astray, allow me to cause Adam and his children to go astray. And God says, yes, you have respite. So in many ways, he's also doing God's work. God's work, yes. Right. Angels. Yeah, I think that's about it, yeah. Please, yeah, go ahead.
I'm afraid I might forget my question. There's so much other to think about. I'm struck by the story in the Quran that Adam and Eve were equally responsible.
Yeah.
And the Christian tradition, the Hebrew Bible,
Yeah.
whatever, Judeo-Christian, Eve is responsible.
Yeah.
Therefore, she has pain in childbirth,
Yeah.
forever and ever and ever. And I'm struck by the difference in the way the Quran tells the story,
Yeah.
which I like. Eve might say that the Muslim tradition really considers men and women more equals, but then what we hear in the West
Yeah.
is quite the opposite of that.
Right,
You
yeah.
have to corrupt,
Yeah.
they're not our equals. So I wonder if you could
Right.
talk about that.
So the question, and your name?
Debbie.
Debbie. So Debbie's question is that in the Quranic telling of the story, it seems like Adam and Eve are equally responsible. And she likes that, as I think do a lot of you, right? Because it doesn't set up this primordial kind of guilt on one half of the human race, basically. But from the other perspective, she's saying that doesn't really harmonize with what one hears about the status of women in Muslim societies, right? Is that a fair summary? Yeah. I think there's a logic that really is helpful in understanding the Quran's view on difference and similarity. So if we just were to move it slightly in another context, it's the same logic that applies, I think, throughout it. Muslims are required to have faith in God, His angels, His messengers, as we were saying, Adam and Eve and Moses and all of those, right? And in one Quranic verse, God says, say Muhammad and those who have faith along with you, that we believe in God, His angels, and His messengers, all of them, and we make no distinction between them. So Muslims love Jesus, really. I mean, this is, it was surprising to me at one moment. I remember the first time, it was pretty early after I came over here, and I came across somebody saying something very nasty about Jesus. I was like, how can you say that? Who cares? I was like, I care, but he said, you're a Muslim. I was like, Muslims love Jesus. As kids, you grow up with all the stories, Mary and Jesus and Moses. These are the characters that the stories were told, So there's an amazing amount of love for all of God's messengers, and they're all considered to be Muslims. The Quran calls them Muslims. You know, it's just that the form was different at their time. So you make no distinction between them. And then God says, and some of the messengers we have raised above others. It's very interesting, right? So at one level, there's a radical, root level equality. They're all messengers. And yet they're all different. So Moses is called the one who speaks with God. That's something specific to him. You know, he spoke on Sinai, you know. And Abraham is called the close bosom buddy of God. Close friend. The word used there is Khalil, which means like people who are like this. That's Abraham's title. Jesus is the Spirit of God. Muhammad is the beloved of God. Other prophets are given different titles as well. So each is the same, and each, of course, given who they are, uniques, are unique. So both are held together at the same time. So same logic I see that we're applying to this aspect as well about the Quran. That at the level of being a human, at the level of standing in front of God, at the level of being responsible, there's no difference between men and women. At the level of the ability to connect with the source, there is no difference there. And yet, at the social level, there are differences. So those are very clearly set apart. And while the Quran does not do this, one of the features of the Islamic tradition is that because the other prophets are considered to be Muslims as well, in order to understand some of the stories, some Muslim scholars bring in the traditions from Judaism and Christianity. So some Islamic understandings are actually populated by and informed by earlier Jewish and Christian readings that make them their way into the culture. So there are certain sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that will make a distinction, that might talk about Eve as being maybe the secondary cause, so to speak. But I think what's clear in the Quranic narrative is that it had to happen. So no matter how it happened, it had to happen. We are putting a successor on earth. So the mechanism itself does not make anybody ultimately responsible. It's the responsibility of both, and it's also the potential of both to be able to turn towards God. And the mechanism is also being given over there. So yes, it's a both-and situation. There's both a kind of spiritual equality, and then because of the way in which society is organized, given the time. I mean, Islam at that time, when Muhammad, this is the reading of the Quran and what the Prophet Muhammad was doing in his time, it was pretty radical in many ways. The rights given to women for that time. So that for a lot of Muslim reformers and people, they look to that and say that there is a intentionality there to actually keep making things more equal, but it depends on the society in which you are. So there's no absolute criteria that's being given. The most important thing is each person's individual relationship to God and the fact that one should be aware that we're going to be responsible for our actions. And in that, there's no difference between men and women. But in terms of social organization, roles, gendered roles, it built on what the societies it was revealed in. It was not, because when we look back, we're really judging by the standards of the last 60 years, not even previously, right? And even if we were to judge Western societies, out of which now we have perhaps one of the most, equal, by some standards, the most equal rights for both sexes. Even that is fairly recent. I mean, we look back and, women wore veils in churches and, there were, so I think that's another important thing to really keep in mind, that not to fall into presentism, to judge everything by the good in which we are and the worst of what they had, So there's something about it that I think ought to cut across time, and there's some universal values. And then I think there's certain other critiques that I think should be made given the circumstances. So, and I was, I think, talking to somebody, it was a last lecture, I found myself on occasions being asked to defend Islam. And there used to be a time when I used to be like, but there's so many other kind of things. It depends on, especially the rights of women, depends on which class of society you're at. I was most familiar with Pakistan, so I just talk about the different places. It depends on what kind of social interaction was taking place. And fortunately, over the last few years, the desire to be a defender either of Islam or Pakistan or US or US foreign policy, I've just given up on that. It's just fallen away. It's like, I'm not responsible for it. You know, it's a different country, different place. People live differently. That's one way of organizing society. It has its positive things and it has its negative things. Just like over here, you know, there's some positives and there's also some negatives. You know, the view of our society and the equality which we think we have appears differently when we're put on different set of glasses and when we're to champion slightly different values, you know? So, anyways, I mean, that's... So, to go back to this story, you know, that I think there's a lot to be learned and that one needs to, in looking at other cultures, one needs to also then look back and see, how is it, are we actually at the epic, you know, at the height of things or no? I mean, it's just like, it's just always a mixture. It's always a mixture. And given the circumstances, one tries to do one's best. So, yeah. Ken?
I have a question, because when you were talking, you were saying that in the Quran, that Adam and Eve and Noah and Moses and Isa and
Yeah.
Muhammad are all considered Muslim.
Muslims, yeah.
I think that in America, the word Muslim is a trigger,
Yeah.
that it's a misunderstood term. And could you give us a
Sure. I think
oversight here?
Ken is asking a very good clarifying question, asking me to give a little bit more context. So Ken is saying that, you know, when the Quran calls all of the, you know, Judeo-Christian biblical prophets Muslims, the word Muslim is a trigger for a lot of people and it's associated with many negative things. So a larger context, yes. So the word Islam, from which the word Muslim comes, Muslim is somebody who practices Islam, comes from the root for salama, which is to, from that we have the word root for salim, so you can hear that resonance there, which means whole. A certain wholesomeness there. And also from that we have the root for peace. So making peace. So a lot of times Islam is translated as surrender. Right? So I think the best way I am able to bring across the meaning of Islam is, you know, that technically, religiously, theologically speaking, it is surrendering to the will of God. And I can just already see some people getting a little tight right there. Yes. But what is the will of God? God has created everything. So based on that, every creature in the cosmos, according to the Quran, is a Muslim. Jinns and human beings have the capacity to consciously surrender or not surrender. But what is really at stake in surrender? I think the literal translation of the word Islam, and then Muslim helps. Islam is a verbal form, a fourth verbal form, which literally means to make, in the pattern, in the Arabic pattern of if'al, which means to make the root idea. So, salama is peace, to make peace, to make whole peace. How do we make peace? We stop fighting, we say hands up. That's where the idea of surrender comes in. You decide not to fight. You decide to repair, perhaps. I mean, so there's different ways of making this peace. So according to the Quran, the Quranic verse goes, one of the Quranic verses goes like this: have you not seen how to God have submitted or have made peace, have, from the root salama, all that is in the heavens and the earth, the sun and the star and the moon and the birds spreading their wings. So within the Abrahamic tradition, the Quran is bringing back really amazing cosmic and naturalistic and kind of, what do you call it? I mean, it really reminds me a lot of Native American tradition. The Quranic view, for me, is very much similar to the Native tradition, where we're living in a live cosmos. The birds and everything out there can be our teachers from one perspective. Look at how well they have surrendered. And I don't know if I've shared this with you or not, but here's one way in which this plays out. And this was very much a reality for me on this. I just was in Pakistan about a month and a half ago. And one of my uncles has started an apiary, and there's, you know, keeping bees. And so there was lots of honey around wherever I would go to visit relatives. my family with lots of honey. So there was a conversation about honey, and the Prophet Muhammad used honey a lot and would take some every day as a medicine. And so honey reminded me of one of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, in which he says, the person of faith, or the believer, the one who has belief, the person who has faith, is like honeybee, who eats what is pure and makes what is pure and wholesome. And when it sits on something, does not break it or corrupt it. So the honeybee is being set up as one possible example of what it means to do wholesome deeds. To go and consume the pure and wholesome, and to make the pure and wholesome. Then he makes so much that it's good for you, and there's plenty for others as well. So that's an example, I think, a really beautiful example in which the Prophet Muhammad actually explains another Quranic verse which happens many, many different times. God says, those who have faith and do wholesome deeds, theirs is a reward. Those who have faith and do wholesome deeds. And what he has done over here is, those who have faith and are like the honeybee. So the honeybee becomes a teacher. So we can, and this goes back to your question, human beings have free will. We can be the honeybee, or we can be that other kind of bee that sits on everything. On everything. And everybody knows what I'm talking about. That sits on everything, Many years ago, I think I mentioned Dr. Rafiq Algan in an interview I was doing with him. I asked him, he's a writer in Turkey and somebody who's been a student of Sufism for many years. He's also an artist as well, a medical doctor. So somebody who really brings together many, many different ways of knowing, and has a real knack for it. And he writes minimalist fiction, so he has a knack for being able to put things in really nice, concise form. So I asked him about religion. I said, how would you define religion? And he said, religion is the development of taste. The development of taste. Religion is to develop taste. And I think what he had in mind, I can now based on this example, is developing a taste for the pure and the wholesome, and developing a distaste for that is not, so that one is involved in doing that which is wholesome. So that's the idea of Islam in the Quran, I would say. That's the way it's explained by the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, the honeybee has a sting too. So it's not like it's all goodness and everything. I mean, most of us have been most probably stung by honeybees. I got stung up quite a few times when I was a kid in the village, because they used to be so cool to try and go close to. There was a little hand pump, and there was a water that would go in and out of there, and just go there and look at them. I still remember very distinctly, very close, and being stung once right here, close to the eye. But mostly they left you alone. So, they have stingers as well, so it's not a totally pacified version of being. There's times where even honeybees sting. So I'm not trying to promote or talk about how there's just no conflict in the life of a bee either. But it is, what is it that actually ends up? We end up choosing. I guess really it's a question of choice here. And I think to bring it back to our conversation for today, what Rumi is saying is that Adam and Eve made honey. Adam and Eve made honey by choosing to take the blame and repairing that relationship and repair that relationship. And Iblis chose to make something bitter and not promoting, reparations by being angry, by looking at the self. So they are very closely tied together. I think once one gets these basic images, the logic really becomes clear, and one is able to see the vision that the Quran is trying to present of humans as a being with free will, living in the cosmos that's all going according to God's laws, and is already a Muslim, is doing things that come instinctually. Just by nature they're submitted, just like the angels are submitted. And then there are beings who can modulate. Yes?
There's a very well-known relationship between potter's clay and fire, does Rumi ever explore the relation between Satan and
Not as much. So the question is, there's a very important relationship between fire and potter's clay. And I think the place where I think Rumi talks about this is the period in between when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. And before they received these words from God, the inspiration to turn and take the blame, right? By some counts, it was hundreds of years, talking about the long lifespans of human beings at that time. And Rumi talks about how Adam and Eve cried rivers and buckets, buckets and buckets and buckets of water. So that was what was needed to feel the pain of separation. And that's what cooked Adam. It cooked Adam. Cooking is the metaphor that Rumi uses the most. One of his most famous poems, I think, is the chickpea. So, he says that, oh, raw chickpea, all of us are raw human beings, For the Sufis, the contemplatives, most of us are only potential human beings. We have the form of humans, but really we have not yet become human, because to be a human, you have to be the successor. You have to portray and bring forth these beautiful character traits and really treat creation with properly. So all of us are on the way to becoming human. There's only very few human beings, alive. And the saints and prophets are those human beings who show what a human being is. The rest of us are all animal human beings. So we're all on our way. Another way of thinking about it is that we are raw. We're uncooked. And all of the strains and tribulations of life, the pressures, are what are cooking us so that we're becoming more mature. So he has this poem called Chickpea, in which the cook is standing there and the chickpea is inside the pot, and it starts to get hot in the pot. It's getting really hot, and the chickpea jumps out. And the cook smacks it back in and says, "Chickpea, if you do not stay in there and bear this heat and get cooked, how will you make it to the king's table? You want to become part of the king's being and body, then you have to get cooked, get used to it." So it's a fire. So love again is a fire, you see. So that's exactly it. So that's where it goes. So the clay needs to be, so that it can then sound nice, raw stuff versus fired stuff. So it's only the fire of separation that allows for a certain insight to come and a certain maturity to arise, for humanness to start manifesting. Because one then knows one's need. Because a lot of times we're living and we don't know our need as well. When we don't have what we desire, and we're in a distance from the beloved, like Majnun had. He was being consumed by that image. Consumed by that image. So, with 3 minutes over. Thank you all very much, and I hope to see you next week.